Slow Burn Media and Bill Huffman present this week's episode of My Passion Case with one of the original podcasters, Jim Harold, where we discuss the Cleveland torso killings. I am absolutely lucky enough to be joined this week by one of the original podcasters in all of podcasting with 30 plus million downloads. Jim Harold joins me today. Thanks for joining me, Jim.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Bill. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and your audience about podcasting and true crime. And again, pleasure to be with you today.
And so what cases are you the most passionate about? I mean, I know that you got into this genre, well, not the genre so much, but the medium of podcasting early on. So what was it that captured your interest?
Well, in podcasting in general, I had been a broadcasting student. I had gone to school for broadcasting, ended up working in radio, but on the advertising side. Okay. And my whole plan had been to be in TV or radio in front of the mic or as a producer, someone on the content side, but I ended up in the advertising side. And I've always been a big fan of talk radio and things. In 2005, I heard about this thing called podcasting. And I listened to people like the really OG podcasters like Adam Curry, who co-invented the medium with Dave Weiner, and Leo Laporte. And I said, oh man, I can't do that. Those guys are fantastic. And then I listened to some of the homemade podcasts that were coming out in 2005. And I'm like, I can do that. And started on the paranormal in 2005, launched a series of different shows over the years. I actually launched my first, my only true crime podcast, Jim Harold's Crime Scene, back in 2011, actually is a premium show. Later, a few years later, took that free. But that's what got me into the medium of podcasting. And it's been an absolute life changer for me. And I've been doing it full time for 7 years now. Now, on the true crime piece, I mean, I think I've always been interested. It's kind of, I never thought about this, but the same thing that got me interested into true crime got me interested in the paranormal. When I was a kid, I'm 50 now. I'm one of the old guys.
Okay.
But when I was a real little kid in elementary school, there was a show on TV called In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. And that got me into the paranormal. And it's not one of these things where I said, well, what can I make money at? When I started podcasting, it's like, I'm really interested in the paranormal. But also I realized, and I didn't really think about this until we communicated on this, it also spurred my interest in true crime. They did a very famous episode on Jack the Ripper, which is a case that I think still fascinates most true crime aficionados to this day. And I think that got me very interested in the subject of true crime. And also, and as I shared with you offline, I live in suburban Cleveland now, but I grew up in the southeast side of Cleveland. Around the 55th and Broadway area. And it just so happens one of the greatest unsolved cases in American history had a definite connection to that area, and that's the Cleveland torso murders. So, I think kind of those two cases informed my interest in the area of true crime, which overlaps my interest in the paranormal, because honestly, you think sometimes, are we dealing with people that just have mental illness, or is there a element of evil involved? Now, I've asked that question of some pretty serious people, and some pretty serious people say, yeah, I think there might be an element of evil.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective for sure.
Yeah, that's, I'm not saying that, that crime is necessarily paranormal. I'm not saying that at all. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying is when we're talking about these very, very dark, violent crimes and serial killers, is it simply mental illness? People who are disturbed or maybe had rough childhoods and horrible things were laid at their door and they were victimized? Is it simply things like that? Or is there also maybe some element of evil? I don't know the answer, and I don't know that anybody does know the answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, putting that spin on it, it definitely does make you wonder with these larger cases like Jack the Ripper and the torso killings, is there something more at work than just mental illness, or, is it evil? I mean, obviously it's evil, but is there something more that's driving it? Now,
I don't want to, real quickly, I don't want to poo-poo the notion of mental illness. That is definitely something that exists. There's no question. And some things are done just by people who are totally insane. There's no question about that. But in some cases, I do wonder if there's an element of evil per se. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I absolutely, I agree. I think that there's, we're not downplaying the importance of mental health. I'm a big advocate for all that stuff. So, the torso killings and Jack the Ripper, it's funny because they do kind of have a correlation to them. And wasn't there, there was some talk that they might be connected at some point.
Yeah, I believe that some people believe that. I don't necessarily believe that, but
yeah, it's a far-fetched theory because there would be such a stretch, such a difference in the amount of years, but the similarities.
And the similarities that here's another odd similarity, and I just thought about this. Remember that the Ripper taunted the authorities. Well, the torso murderer taunted Eliot Ness and said, you can't catch me. And that was another thing that people don't realize, people outside the Cleveland area, that Eliot Ness was the safety director here and ran for mayor. And this was like the one that got away, right? The torso murder, never having been able to nail him down. And I'm assuming it was a him. But I think that's probably a pretty good assumption. I remember as a kid, actually, and I was probably like 12 or 13 years old, driving by the central area in Cleveland and seeing that building with the how they used to paint billboards on the sides of old buildings, and you would sometimes they would like tear down one building and the bin right next to it. And then the billboard was like pristine from like 1920 or something. Well, in this case, it was quite faded at the time. And you can find pictures of this online. But I believe it was in the central neighborhood. There was actually an Eliot Ness for mayor billboard painted on one of those buildings, which I think has since been torn down. But that was wild to go there, past there like in the 80s and see, oh my gosh, Eliot Ness for mayor. How wild is that? So I also think that plays into the question of history with true crime. I am very drawn to older cases and interested in, we'll even talk about things like the Black Dahlia case. Historical cases have always fascinated me, and I think that ties in with my interest in history, which oddly enough ties back into the paranormal, because I think that's a big part of famous paranormal cases, the history of a place. So it all kind of ties together if you look at the threads.
Yeah, if you do Google that Eliot Ness for mayor building, it comes up like first thing. It's an eye opener because people always associate him with Al Capone and the Untouchables, and he had this whole second life that was completely the opposite as far as success goes here in Cleveland. It was the safety director, and then he basically wasn't able to be elected mayor because he couldn't catch the torso killer. Yeah.
And I think there was some controversy about a car accident too with him. And and if I remember correctly, he helped write the Untouchables book that the TV series was based on, but I don't think he got to see the full success of that book, which ironically, Untouchables, Eliot Ness was played by Robert Stack, who went on to host another great show that was a great influence on me, Unsolved Mysteries. So it is odd when you look at the connections, how it all ties together.
Yeah, it's sort of the old Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation.
Exactly.
I was just looking at I was like, why is Robert Stack popped up here? Because that's like one of the things that's in, I just Google imaged it and it's like the fourth name there. It says Robert Stack. And I'm like, what?
Yeah. That's the thing younger people forget, that Stack played Eliot Ness. Of course, that show was focused on his time in Chicago and his success with running out Capone and the bootleggers and all that stuff. So that was a far more kind of a positive stage of Ness's career.
Yeah. What about the torso killings though? Like, what was the background as far as what actually occurred?
Well, basically, there's some people who think that there may have been 13 or more victims in the Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh areas. And I'm actually, I have to be honest, I'm looking at Wikipedia to refresh some of my memory on this.
Totally.
And there's a great guy in Cleveland who has done a lot of work on this, James Badal, but I don't know his status now. I interviewed him a couple of years ago. But the thing is that this happened in an area called Kingsbury Run. Mm-hmm. Now, the odd thing is that some books I have read had posited that it was whoever was doing this was possibly a doctor, possibly operating out of that Broadway area I told you about. And here's two really freaky things for me personally. One is there's a theory that the person who committed these torso murders, and they're called torso murders because the people were decapitated, their hands, their feet were cut off, so there'd just be a torso left. Really.
Were they surgically?
The thought is that it was done very surgically, yes.
Okay.
So anyhow, the point being that the doctor who some theorize did it was involved, worked at St. Alexis Hospital. Now, St. Alexis Hospital which no longer exists, I think there is a velodrome there. They race bicycles. But up until the 90s, I think it was, or early 2000s, there was a hospital there. A hospital that I was born in.
No kidding. Wow.
So now, I think that the building that I was born in was a different building. I think they tore down the old one. But still, on that piece of ground, I was born there, and possibly the torso murderer operated out of there. And then there's also a funeral home in the area, which I don't know if it's still a funeral home, but it was there when I lived, I lived in that area from I was born in 69, from 69 up until 93. And there was a funeral home there, which I think changed hands before I was born, but I actually went to funerals there. And supposedly there's some thoughts, if it's the one I'm thinking about, that possibly the killer actually worked at one of their facilities or used one of their facilities to do his dirty work. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but that's one of the theories. So the thing is, I'm walking around here, in my teenage years and so forth, in areas the torso murderer was right there. It's just crazy to me. So I think that resonates with me personally, just knowing the places and where all this happened. They talk about one place called Jackass Hill, and my uncle all the time talked about Jackass Hill, and that's in Kingsbury Run over there. So it's really weird to know that you lived in this place, and it was a very depressed area. I mean, it was less so when I was growing up, and it's become a very, very depressed area now. But just to know you lived where all this happened, it's just crazy.
It's seen better days as far as the area goes, but I mean, man, that the fact that they still don't. I mean, I'm looking at Wikipedia too, and they've got 12 to 20 victims possibly, and it's just it's one of those things that in that neighborhood, I just think that there probably wasn't as much of a concern about catching somebody who may be committing these crimes. I mean, even though it was a huge story,
I think you were dealing with the people that were being killed were hobos in the Weber phrase. I'm sure that's not the politically correct phrase now, but at the time they were considered hobos, vagrants, not necessarily, the upper crust of society. And we see the same thing today, right? If you have someone who is killed in the inner city of any major American city, it's kind of a footnote. And then if you get somebody who's killed in the suburbs, it's headlines. We see the same thing now. It still goes on, unfortunately.
I definitely understand how that works. I mean, you have a murder in the suburbs and it's front page news. You have a murder in the greater Cleveland area and it's just another, if it even makes the paper, it's just...
Yeah. It's on page 5B, or if there even is a 5B anymore.
I was just going to say,
kind of passe at this point, but you don't hear a lot about it as the basis, and that's been something. And I don't know what the answer is to it. I just think about. I think we just came on the anniversary here of the Sowell killings. And I can't remember how many women it was, something like 10 women. And certainly that was publicized. But my goodness, had that been in the suburbs, oh my gosh, you would have never gotten away from it. And, I saw an item on the news, I think it was a 10-year anniversary or something. And it's a horrible, horrible situation. And I think there's some thought that many of those women were in prostitution. But the point being, that their lives are just as valuable as anybody else's, and just for it to be kind of swept under the rug in a manner of speaking. It's kind of sad.
Unfortunately, what it boils down to sometimes, too, is having the people that carry the torch or carry the flag for that victim, because sometimes if those people are in prostitution, they are disconnected from the rest of society. And unfortunately, there isn't always an advocate for them. And that's not fair. They're, like you said, they're just like anybody else, and they should be treated the same way. And finding anybody's killer should be priority number one, no matter who or what or
correct
how they died.
Exactly right. I agree 110%.
So as far as the torso killings, I see that they think that he may have killed later than the last victim in 38.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes up to the 50s in some other markets, because it was interesting. A lot of this was that area had a lot of railroad tracks and things. So a lot of people think that maybe whoever this was traveled by train. Of course, there's always the possibility of copycats, right? Somebody reads about this, and who knows? Maybe the torso murderer himself had read accounts of Jack the Ripper, and maybe that inspired him, for example, to write those letters to Ness. So you can't discount that, particularly in that particular time, because now, with all of the crime scene evidence that can be gleaned and used, if you think about it, it's one of those situations where they can kind of tell if it's a copycat, because they can look at things but we're talking about years ago, and this really is the very, very early years of criminology. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they were nearly sophisticated. I know they weren't nearly sophisticated, and I think that copycat killers could be more easily lumped into the main suspect, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I especially think with the tracks being right there, there's definitely, with all the victims being, or not all the victims, but the majority of the victims not being identified, I think that has to do with the fact that, they're not hobos. They rode the trains. And so they could be from any state across the country. So if they're making a stop in Cleveland and they just so happen to run into the wrong guy, or somebody's stalking that particular train area, I think that's just like prime picking, is a terrible way of saying it, but you're just basically having victims driven to your doorstep. Hey guys, it's me, your host, Bill Huffman. I just wanted to pop in the middle of the episode and give you guys the heads up that for the second year in a row, I will be representing Who Killed Amy Mihaljevic and My Passion Case on Podcast Row at this year's CrimeCon 2020 in Orlando. The event runs May 1st through the 3rd, and if you've never been, I really suggest it, especially if you're a true crime fanatic. I also have a promo code for you guys to use if you'd like to save on your ticket, and that promo code is Amy2020. So again, I hope you're enjoying this show. But for the second year in a row, I will be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2020. And again, if you want to use my promo code to save on your ticket, my promo code is Amy2020.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's some thought that, and I'm not going to mention any names here, but some of the main suspects in the torso murders had political connections, and that those were kind of brought to the fore and kind of protected certain people from being outed. I believe the case, if I'm not mistaken, there was one gentleman who was put into a facility, and after he was put into that facility, the murders stopped.
Yeah, so I've heard about that, and I've also heard, the rumor being, and I'm not going to say names, but I did hear that Ness had made a deal with somebody. He kind of made a deal with the devil because he lost the election in order to stop the killings. From what I know, it sounds like there's a very good possibility that was the person that was committing the crimes.
Right.
And that Eliot Ness wanted to climb the political ladder if he saw an opportunity to do so, but it may have backfired.
Right. Now, the other thing here is that yet another kind of corollary to the Jack the Ripper case. I would say that the Cleveland torso murders are kind of like the American Jack the Ripper, and I'm not the first person who's made that comparison, by the way. I think many people have. There was also a thought that, for example, Jack the Ripper may have been, I believe, a duke, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that, or a member of, the upper crust, and that was covered up on that side of the pond, as it were. Don't know if that's true, obviously. I don't know if we'll ever find out who either one of these people were, because they're the coldest of cold cases, right? I mean, if there were any DNA evidence, it's probably so contaminated at this point. I think that Patricia Cornwell, right? She tried to launch her own investigation into Jack the Ripper, and she thought it was the artist Walter Sickert, because Sickert, I believe, had some mental issues. I'm not sure. But he did do a painting. She had a painting that she showed in her research that looked very much like one of the crime scenes.
I remember that.
Yeah, but I think other people have come back and said, no, it couldn't have been Sickert for thus and so reason. So I just wonder, are we ever going to get to the bottom of these cases, Bill, because they're so old? Obviously, nobody's left to talk to, none of the witnesses, and any kind of forensic evidence has probably been so gone over and so reviewed, and also probably so contaminated. I know there were DNA efforts for a stamp from Jack the Ripper, which I don't know what the result of that was. But to me, it's just like it's going to be both of those are going to be eternal mystery.
I do believe that they're going to be mysteries, and I think that's why they are kind of the... when you think about true crime or you think about serial killings, you first think of Jack the Ripper, then you maybe think Zodiac. Torso killings, maybe just because of the fact, but we're from Cleveland, so it's more relevant to us. Right. Again, like if it was a different type of... If it was a suburban crime, it would be so much more known. But I know that there was talk back in the 2000s that, I think Fincher and Matt Damon were attached to the Torso movie that was going to be filmed, and they were going to film it in Detroit, but nothing ever came out of that. But I'm glad they didn't film it in Detroit, just because it needs to be filmed in Cleveland if they're going to film it anywhere. I hate it when they do that stuff.
Yeah. They just did
To Kill the Irishman.
Yeah, they did that. And I interviewed the author of that, and he was great, Rick Palillo. But, they did it. I think they did that in Detroit, too, which I understand. I mean, it kind of looks similar. The inner city looks similar. Actually, that what they were showing there looked very similar to the area I grew up. So, I mean, but still, you'd like to have it shot in Cleveland. It would be nice.
Yeah, and I remember we didn't have the tax credits, so I think that was the reason back then. And they're always looking to save money, especially on those independent films.
They're going to go where they can get it the cheapest, I'm sure.
But it's like I drive by that place where Danny Green was killed like every other week, and it's just like in the movie he's killed in like the downtown area, and I'm just like, it's just not how it happened.
It's not how it happened. No, I occasionally would drive past there with my kids, and we would make a joke of it, because every time we drive by there, I'm like, that's where they blew up a guy named Danny Green. And it is kind of chilling. And I've gone into that office before. I actually had an appointment one time in that office. I got to tell you, it felt a little funny coming out and coming back and starting your car. It's like, it was like 1976 or whatever it was. Yeah. But, and if folks don't know what we're talking about, Danny Green, of course, famous person with mob ties, supposedly, here in the Cleveland area, who was not when Cleveland for a short time was known as Bomb City, USA.
Yeah, that's actually a good opportunity for me to give a quick plug, because that's going to be you might want to be interviewed if you want to be on it. I'm doing a Bomb City, USA podcast, just like
that's great.
6 to 8 episode series on that whole story, because it's just so unique, and it's sort of like what we're talking about with the Torso killings, and how sometimes these regional cases, they can just be forgotten nationally, because Cleveland's not Chicago and it's not New York City, and we were a big city back then, but now we're just, we're I don't know, I think 20th in the market as far as media goes. So back then we were a top 5 city, and I just think some of these killings and some of these, like the Sowell case, I mean, you want to talk about the opportunities they missed there. I mean, they blamed it on the sausage plant that's like a block away.
Yeah, it's horrible.
I mean, like, oh yeah, that terrible smell. Oh, that's just a sausage place. Well, I work for News 5. I mean, how many killings have we had in this past month of just people being killed in these abandoned homes? I mean, if we could just get rid of those, we could be, that's a whole nother podcast.
Indeed. Well, the thing is that I got to tell you, Bill, it is interesting. And the thing about, and I didn't have any knowledge of anything, but, very familiar with I live on the east side of Cleveland. eastern suburbs. So, I mean, I've driven through Little Italy quite a few times. You know, that's our Italian area, and it's a great little district, and it's got great restaurants and things. But you kind of think if you go back to those days, and you know, yeah, to a lot of people, the 70s are ancient history, but it's not that long ago.
No.
And you know, when you see some of the last names, it's like I've seen some last names mentioned. It's like, oh, I knew somebody with that last name. Are they?
I don't even want to talk about that because I have such a close tie to one that I'm like, that I know was, you know, I'm not going to say much more because I know there's just, I'll say it offline, but yeah, there was a lot of, a little too many similarities, and
it's like, oh, did I know somebody who knew somebody? Oh, that's scary.
Yeah, and there's a reason why my parents, they really didn't want me to go over there. I kind of get it now. It's one of those things that I didn't realize at the time, but
you'd be enjoying a plate of pasta and get whacked.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me, and this is, now we're really going offline here, but if you remember from the, I don't know if it was in the 80s or when it was exactly, but it was in New York, the one mobster, and he was a top-line mobster. He came up very high thinking he was killed in a restaurant.
Oh, was that Paul? Was that the one that got you whacked?
Yeah, I think so. So.
I forget his last name.
Yeah, that's the Castellano. Was it Castellano?
Yeah, Paul Castellano.
But anyway, I just envisioning that. You could see something like that probably, you know, to my knowledge, nothing like that ever happened in Little Italy, but you could see some of that like that happening there, you know, back in the day.
I used to work with this one guy. He talked about how in the 70s, when, you know, they would be playing outside, they would hear explosions. Like it was, because, I mean, you know, again, but they got the moniker Bomb City, USA because somebody from Time Magazine gave them that name, because we had 36 car bombing, or 30, it wasn't car bombings, but 36 different bombings in 1 year. You think about that today, I mean, holy crap. Like, now granted, these weren't bombs that were trying to kill people all the time, but they did kill people.
Yeah, it's amazing to think in your own hometown this was going on not that long ago. And you look at the old pictures and you look at and even though To Kill the Irishman was filmed, and it's worth watching because of the fact that Val Kilmer does a good job playing the cop and talking about the theatrical and, you know, that whole restaurant, and you just think of the old days in the 70s and the grit and the grime of Cleveland. And it was a pretty intense place. I remember the area where I grew up. I had one of my instructors drove me home one night. I needed a ride, and he came back in the next week, and he said, you know, everybody here thinks Jim is like Joe Suburban. He lives in Hell's Kitchen, because you could see the smokestacks, the BOFs from, at that time, LTV Steel, and the fire belching into the air, and it looked kind of spooky.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at the pictures, it's just like, I can't tell if it's sepia or is that smog? Like,
probably smog. There was a famous Cleveland journalist who just recently passed in the last year or so, Dick Fegler, and he used to write a column first for the Press, then the Plain Dealer. Oh, it was fantastic, and he used to joke about his. I don't know. He had different characters he would write about, and I think there were like composite characters, and he would write about Aunt Millie or whoever it was hanging up her sheets in that area there, and when she'd take them down from the line, they were orange. And
it's funny, but it's not.
I got to tell you, when I was a kid in the 70s, even the 80s, you would drive down 77, and then let's say you would go down to Akron or something, and then you would drive back. When you hit a certain level, it was past Independence, and as you were driving up towards like Grant Avenue and that on 77, you could tell when you were close because you would literally smell the steel mill.
I mean, honestly, so I was a kid during the 80s, like early 80s.
Right.
So I remember that smell like vividly. I don't even need to, it's like the smell of the old Brown Stadium.
Yeah.
Stale beer and drunk urine and cigarette smoke, like people smoking in the stadium. Like, what the hell?
I mean, it was a tough place. I mean, yeah, as you were driving, if you were driving down towards Akron, you'd see that big Goodyear sign that used to be there for decades.
Oh, I hate when they took that down.
Yeah, that's a part of Cleveland that's gone, and yeah, that was sad. But when you go back the other way, yeah, you get down to probably 71 Grand Avenue, and you get that smell. It's like, we're close to home.
Oh, it's kind of that like rusty. Yeah,
sulfurish. Yeah. It was definitely, there was a smell.
Yeah, there was definitely a smell. So back to the torso killings. So do you think that, I mean, you didn't want to name any suspects, but do you believe that story about Ness making a deal, or is that something that you put as sort of a rumor / that's sort of the, let's just kind of put a bow on it? Because it does sort of seem like a nice way of wrapping up the story, and it kind of seems...
I think that, well, let me say this, is that you're probably familiar with the theory that I'm not familiar with, because I had heard in general terms it may have been covered up because of a connection to a family. I did not hear this theory that Eliot Ness agreed to these things to further his career. I got to say, I mean, anytime you have power, there's corruption. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but I can't speak to this specific deal. But do I think that, yeah, if they figured out, okay, this one person's doing it, and he's totally insane, and we'll lock him away so he can't hurt anybody, but we'll keep it quiet. Could I see that happening in the 1930s? Absolutely.
Yeah, and honestly, I wasn't like, I was more speculating on that. I just know that the rumor that I heard is that he had kind of made a deal, but I was just speculating on the fact that it could be something that would potentially bolster his future political standing, opposed to being something that would damage his career. Because you wouldn't think that somebody who's running for mayor would put himself in a position that's going to screw himself. I mean, he probably thought he was doing something, if he did do that he was doing something that would benefit him. That was where I was going with that.
Yeah. I got to believe that, honestly, if you really think about it, that the chances of corruption are pretty high, I think. That's not to say Ness, I mean, think about it. Even somebody could have come down on Ness and said, we're going to do it this way. We're going to handle it this way. I don't know. Because from what I understand, Ness had some integrity. So I don't know if he would have done that or not. Perhaps, people will do things that they normally wouldn't do if power and the opportunity is presented with them. But I got to think, if you are a lawman or a lawwoman, for that case, if you have this one big case, I got to believe that nagged at him his whole life not to have been able to catch this person.
It's a kind of a good segue into what kind of life he had the rest of his life. And it wasn't very pretty. I mean, he was an alcoholic. I think this was it's exactly what you said. It weighed on him for the rest of his life. I mean,
and if you think about it, he had these great successes, and then he had to deal with this, and he probably, it's kind of like, to bring it back to football, but if you think about like a player who has been great their whole career, and then they're hit with the adversity. I mean, this is a lot more serious stuff. We're talking about life and death and criminals and killers and things. But, when you have a lot of success and then you have adversity, it's interesting to see where some people can handle it and come back, and some people, they can't.
Yeah, I definitely feel that Ness would have been one of those people that if he did make that kind of deal, it would have hurt him, like, mentally. And back then, especially without knowing what mental health, all the ways that you can deal with mental health and stress, I think there are a lot of unhealthy ways back then to deal with it. And I think that he didn't choose the best ways to deal with, whether it was his inability to catch the guy or he made the deal. I mean, I've heard rumors, again, you hear things after so many years, but like you've said in the first segment of the show, where you talk about how will we ever find an answer to these mysteries because of the fact that they're so old. I think we'll find an answer if, and this is a big if, but let's say they're able to, the only way, this is my opinion, the Ness stuff comes out is if they find like old papers and old, in some relatives, whatever, after they pass away. It's sort of like the post-deathbed confession type of thing, where we won't get an answer because there just is nobody, like you said, to talk to. The witnesses are so long gone. The people that they would have shared the stories with aren't even of sound mind. Not necessarily they're all that old. It's so old. The story is so old. I mean, we're talking 82 years ago.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount of time. And the thing is that in terms of Ness using this as political leverage, I mean, I don't think he ran for mayor until the late 40s. So I don't know about that part of it. I mean, it may be, you may know something I don't, but I just wonder if that was because, as I understand it, Capone's people wanted to bribe Ness and he turned it down. You know, maybe he didn't, and there's some evidence, I guess, that he was in a car accident and alcohol may have been involved and he tried to, so I'm not saying he's a Boy Scout. I mean, I don't know about the political piece is all I'm saying. And it's been so long ago. I mean, probably not many people alive know, unless it was documented and those kind of things. But you make a great point. I know that the Western Reserve Historical Society has a lot of Ness's papers and, maybe something can be found. But boy, I got to believe a lot of people have looked at that. The foremost person on that, I believe, is in the Cleveland area. Now, I don't know his current status. We talked a few years ago. I know he was older. It's James Badal. Mm-hmm. And he's done more research on this probably than anybody living and wrote an excellent book on it. You know, that's, if you're interested in the case, that's a great place to look at his book. And I could probably look it up real quick here for folks and see what it is. But he's been a great author and a great researcher on this. Let's see. I will find the book for everybody. There's a couple of books he's done, and I will find those momentarily. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. And then it's actually, it's crazy. You look at his personal life, and I mean, he was married at a time when divorce wasn't very common. I mean,
yeah, 3 times, right?
3 times, yeah.
Yeah. Badal's most recent book on it, and he's done, looks like a couple of books on this. But James Badal did In the Wake of the Butcher, Cleveland's Torso Murders, and that was released in 2014. And very, very well done.
Yeah, that's a good plug. I definitely check that book out. I find this case so fascinating. It's just so, especially living in the area. And I'm just glad that we're able to talk about this case because I didn't know exactly which case you were going to choose this time. So the fact that we're able to kind of bring this case to a national platform and kind of say, this was America's Jack the Ripper. And this really was the first of, I mean, we had H.H. Holmes, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to like downplay all that other stuff. But as far as the type of killings that occurred and the amount of killings, this is ridiculous. I mean, yeah. It's a story that should be more known than it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I thank you so much for bringing this story back to the forefront. Do you have any final thoughts on what your feelings are on the cases that we've discussed?
Well, the thing is that I think I think I fall victim to this as well. But you have to remember, even the case is 100 years old, whatever. I know that many of us enjoy delving into these cases and enjoy the mystery, but we should never lose sight that there were real victims, that real violence was visited upon. Whether they were ditch diggers, quote, hobos, ladies and men of the night, whatever they may have been, they were people. They didn't deserve to die this way, and we should never lose sight of the victims. I think that's really important. Certainly, we can look at the mystery and wonder who did it and read the books and listen to the podcasts and all that, but never forget there are real people, the real consequences behind these stories.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a great way to highlight the fact that these people need to be recognized just the same as anybody else because they are living, breathing humans just like you and me. And there's nothing that makes them any different than us. And it's unfair that they have to kind of sort of get pushed to the side. And, we saw it with the Sowell case and, how quickly that kind of went from being a story to just sort of back page news. And you look at, not to compare, well, I'm going to compare them. I mean, you look at the Amanda Berry and the Gina DeJesus. I mean, they're still around. It's still a story that is always talked about. And Sowell has kind of been pushed to the back burner because unfortunately, we just don't have the advocates to get out there and be their cheerleaders. And that's so unfortunate. There needs to be a more of a support system, I believe, for that type of victim.
I agree. And Bill, thank you so much for inviting me on the show today. It's been great to talk with people and talk about these cases. And I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, I really do appreciate it. And I absolutely look forward to talking with you again in the future. So thanks so much again.
Thank you, Bill.
Many thanks to the one and only Jim Harold for coming on this week's episode of My Passion Case to speak some truth about the Torso killings. And again, the Torso killings in Cleveland are really the American version of Jack the Ripper. So if you guys are interested in looking up information about that case, feel free to Google it. It is very intriguing. As I said before, I do drop new episodes of My Passion Case on Mondays. I also drop new episodes of my other series, Who Killed, on Fridays. And as a reminder, if you'd like to help support the show, you can do so by clicking the donate button on slowburnmedia.com, and that is slow minus the W, or you can contribute via the Venmo app with my username at Bill-Huffman-3. And I will also provide a link in the show notes. And just so you know, every contribution does help these podcasts stay running. Now, you can also help support the show by submitting a review, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Those 5 stars help keep these cases that I cover in the spotlight. So if you'd like to stay up to date on the shows that I have covered, as well as the new shows I have in the pipeline, please follow me on Twitter at BillHuffman3. And you guys, thanks so much again for tuning in to this week's episode of My Passion Case. Thank you, Jim Harold. And guys, until next time, be safe.